Yeah, when you weren't here.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. First of all, I wanted to welcome you to the very first research roundtable, which we're going to showcase the work of our very new colleagues, Drs. Cote, Chatman, Foxman, Smith, and Markowitz. When we first met, I guess the week before school was about to start, our new colleagues were very eager to get in front of you, let them know what they're doing, find ways to engage the community, and we thought, okay, this is the product of that. And so we wanted to find a way to showcase their work with the hope that out of this comes at least a better understanding of the work that we're doing collectively here at the SOJC, and in the best case opportunity, a co-authorship, a collaboration, a new way to build bridges. And so this is it. And so I'll turn it over to our first speaker. Should we just go in order of appearance? So from left to right. You drew the short straw, David.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. If you can't see, I'm Dave Markowitz. I'm really excited to talk to you about who I am and what kind of work I do. And as you'll see at the end, I'm always looking to have collaborators and colleagues who I can make new inferences about the world about. So just to quickly tell you about who I am from two main perspectives. The first one is that I'm a computational social scientist. So I make inferences about people through their language patterns. And one of the things I like to do, as some of the things that you'll see now, is that I like to make inferences about people through their patterns on social media. So what I've done is that recently I've developed a tool that allows you to essentially scrape two Twitter feeds and make inferences about people, about leadership qualities, about if they're lying, about if they're overly emotional, if they potentially have a depressive state, or if they're super happy just from their language patterns. And who better than to look at some of the people that are near and dear to our hearts. So essentially, anyone with a public Twitter handle, you can investigate who they are, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing psychologically, just from their word patterns. So, as prior work suggests, leaders such as Dr. Martin Luther King use more collective pronouns than personal pronouns. So we, our, and us are more prominent than I, me, and my in leaders relative to those who are followers. So let's compare. If we look at Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, they actually are pretty consistent, although Donald Trump his writing style suggests that he's at least represented more as a leader on Twitter compared to Hillary Clinton. However, if we look at another dimension such as honesty, we look at just from a little bit that Donald Trump, they're pretty much flat. They're pretty much the equivalent here. But we see a representative tweet of someone who looks at someone who's a liar versus not. We see a tweet on the left just from word patterns such as fewer personal pronouns and more negative emotion terms. We see that Donald Trump has a specific tweet in mind that is more deceptive than not, compared to other people like Sylvia Plath and Happy, the fictional character from Disney, who has a more emotional style. We're able to infer psychological information about people just from the words that they use online. We can scrape that with automated methods, really lightweight tools that I'm actually teaching the students in J460 this term, how we can actually do that and make inferences about people from their digital traces. Now, one of the projects that I'm working on right now that I'd like to demonstrate this a little bit more concretely is through a project that I'm working on, there we go, looking at National Science Foundation grants and how you can predict how much money you're going to get with the NSF just from the language patterns of the abstracts. So essentially, this figure here represents how much money that the grant receives. These are all funded grants, compared to how many words are in the actual grant abstract. There's a strong positive correlation between how many words you use in the abstract and how much money you're going to receive. However, there is a little bit more that we can infer from this. So this actually constitutes about 20,000 grants, 7 million words across 8 different years. And what are the predictors of how much money you're actually going to get? So the longer you are, the more money you're going to receive. I can tell you later what the actual ideal word count is. And if you have more words per sentence, you're also going to be receiving more money. So the more complex your writing is, the more money you're going to receive from the NSF. If you use fewer common words, so not only complexity of the actual syntax, but complexity of the word itself is actually more important. If you're more certain and less tentative with your writing, you're going to receive much more money from the National Science Foundation. Now, I'd like to poll the audience, as Regis Philbin would like to do in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. What are the answers to these two questions, just based on intuition? And then I'll tell you what the data say. So the first question is, what's the ideal word count for maximizing how much money you're going to receive from the National Science Foundation? Any guess? Ed?
738.
We had coffee yesterday. Although it's 783.
Okay.
So it's pretty much on the nose. So the average word count, so across all abstracts, all about 20,000 of them, is only about 400. So people who write about 400 words, they still get money, but the ideal word count to get the most after controlling for the directorate of the grant, when it was written, all these other things you control for the analysis, you get the most amount of money if you have 783 words. Now the second question is, how much is a single word worth? And Ed, I'd like you to refrain from this. How much? One word. What's a word worth? Any guesses?
10,000.
Ooh, that'd be a lot of money. Anything else? $390. So we're able to do that just by looking at simple stats and simple regressions, just by trying to predict what words and how they correlate to actual funding amounts. Now, I promised you that I have a second hat here. I'm a media psychologist as well. So I study how people interact with technology and how that reveals things about what we're thinking and feeling and how that can reveal our psychological states. For some of my work I've done of what the effect of exercising self-control in the mobile phone is, all the way to how you can understand the patterns of deception in mobile dating conversations and how that reveals our intentions to actually date another person, and the average it's about 7% of how many lies we're actually communicating to another person on our mobile dating apps. So all the way from how we analyze words and how that can reveal our psychology to what our technology can reveal about our psychology and how it affects our social and psychological states, that's the world that I work in. And I hope that over the next few years and beyond, we can work together to actually make this happen and really increase the research profile here. So thank you very much.
So we're going to move expeditiously through our research presentations, but the hope is at the end of this we'll have some time for question and answer. So with this, we'll turn it over to Dr. Smith.
Which one is yours?
Smith, research.
Oh, the one that says your name.
I'll do it.
Can I just?
Yeah,
I'm just
that
gonna
should
stay
work.
seated closer to the microphone. Perfect. So we were asked today just to tell you a little bit about our backgrounds, the kind of theories that we use, the kind of methods that we use, to give you a little bit better idea of our work. So I'm going to start with my background. So I am actually a former journalist.
Oh, that's weird. There we go. It's the down button.
Oh,
Not the
perfect.
up
Okay. All right, so I'm actually a former journalist. I worked at a community newspaper. This is the community in which I grew up, so I was actually very invested in the issues that I was covering. I was a general beat reporter, so I covered science issues, I covered environmental issues, covered pretty much everything, restaurant openings, town hall meetings, anything that you could think of. And it was that experience, that time that I was working professionally, that led me back to my graduate work in really looking at the media's role in society, particularly with environmental issues. And that stemmed from some work I did covering environmental issues at this local paper. So at my doctoral, I'm going backwards. My doctoral education, I think it's really important to mention just because it informs how I think about everything. It's really where my thinking was shaped and kind of has affected everything I do. So my doctoral program, I was one of 25 PhDs that was funded by an experimental NSF program at the University of Maine. It was called the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, and it was all team-based science. So as a doctoral student within this program, I had 7 people on my committee. They represented 5 different disciplines, and you were required to have 2 advisors, each from 2 different disciplines. So it was really looking at how do you have an interdisciplinary experience that was focused on team-based science, and it was all about finding local solutions to local problems. So we were all based in teams that were looking at problems that people were facing in the state of Maine. So it was really place-based research. From that, So I had 4 years. I was on the knowledge to action team, so my specialty was science communication. So I worked on the team that worked across all the other teams. We worked on climate change, we worked on water quality, we worked on economic issues, and we were working with all the other teams to think about how we accelerate that team science and the impact that it had within the state of Maine. So how do we communicate all the research that we were producing at the University of Maine? How do we get decision makers to pay attention to it? And we created a science communication program there called the Blue Sky Faculty Fellows. It's still going, and we're still studying the effects of that, where we actually train faculty members to communicate to different audiences. Particularly, we're focused on policymakers so we can get more funding at the state level, and so our science can actually make a difference at the state level. So how do we get people within the state to actually make decisions using the information that we produce? So thinking about, I have 3 primary areas. I look at the media's role in society. What role does it have in informing people's understanding, particularly of environmental and science issues? So some work I've done with that is with the Forest Service, looking at how different kinds of policies and different kind of issues are reported on, basically looking for patterns in the data, looking at how framing happens and what are the effects of that. Going beyond that, then I look at what are the effects of those patterns that we see in the media. So an example of this is a study that we did with the Maine Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where we looked at messages about arsenic contamination, and we paired up with the state toxicologist to see what kind of messages would actually get people to order and return a state water test to actually test their well water for arsenic contamination. And then we followed up with, would they actually, if they found a positive result, what kind of messaging could we do to actually get them to address the problems in their well water? And now I'm really focused on, well, how do we do it better? So thinking about interventions that we can run. So different kinds of trainings with journalists who cover science and environmental issues. What kind of curriculum should we be doing? What kind of experimental education should we be doing with that? And how do we measure the effects of that? So we've done some partnership with the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting, that we look at the effects of specific training curriculum for journalists who are covering science issues. We're also doing some work with the National Park Service about how they communicate science and how they can do it better as well. So thinking about what kind of training they offer in-house. They actually don't offer any training in-house, so thinking about science communicators within the National Park Service, because that's part of their mission. So what I'm doing here, we're starting a project. We just got funded for wildland fire media research, so looking at how the media covers fires in the West and how we can change that at the undergraduate level, so doing some experiential education, thinking about journalism through the J School here, partnering with rural communities who are affected by wildland fire. We're continuing our project with science and storytelling within the national parks, and hopefully running some actually experimental curriculum that we hope park visitors will take part in as well, and hopefully that's going to run here at Crater Lake. We're also putting together a proposal with the physics department and with universities on the East Coast. We're actually the only West Coast university who will be on the proposal for experimental undergraduate science education, partnering with, planetariums in Bend, Oregon, and community partners throughout the state. And then also just thinking about how do we measure the effects of science communication at large, because it's such a big thing that we're dealing with today. Key dimensions of my work. The biggest things with my work, almost everything that I do is team-based science. So almost everything that I do is interdisciplinary. I have a lot of partners outside of the J School, work with a lot of different scientists from different backgrounds. And I also try to work with community partners in almost all of the work that I do. So thinking about our goal is to actually get the science to be used at the end. Think about who's going to be affected by the kind of work that we're producing, how are they going to use it, and how can we get them involved in the process way sooner than just trying to put out a journal article. Most everything else I do is in systems framework, and I always use mixed methods. So rarely anything that I do is just one method. It's usually 1, 2, 3 methods combined, and hopefully learning from the other people on our interdisciplinary team, trying to do some interesting work instead of just relying on one method. And these are some examples of the people who fund the work that I do. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. And I would love to talk more about the kind of programs we're trying to get off the ground here.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Maxwell Foxman.
Hello, everyone. I'll be treading a similar path to Hollie's in describing both my current research and some methodological and theoretical background for it. So, if everything loads, that would be great. Hey! And there should be a full screen. Yeah, that's it. Just to make sure that works. Yay, okay. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be able to introduce my work to all of you. I've titled this talk, as you can see, Playing with Reality, not just because it's the working title for the book that I'm currently proposing to publishers, but also because it encapsulates the three prongs that make up my research, specifically virtual reality technologies, game production, and the relationship of those two things to media coverage and journalism. As you can see here, and I hope to illustrate today, I think they're all quite related. So I'm going to use my time at this roundtable to first explain how I fit into these subjects, both methodologically and theoretically, and then I'm going to illustrate the relationship between them with projects that I have and will be working on in the next few months ahead. So I think the first question is, how do I fit in all of this? Well, my primary research interests have revolved around studying games, the game industry, and play, all of which I see as pervading most parts of contemporary life. You can think of strategies, gamification strategies of major corporations, or the fact that journalists are making news games and other sorts of playful content as examples. And I often lump games and play together quite explicitly because I think you can't deal with one without dealing with the other. Any game, whether it's a VR experience like the one that I'm featured in there, or just a card game, just sort of sits there until you start playing. So I've made it my mission to try to get at the visceral experience of play. And it's really been a constant interest of mine. And in order to try to apprehend it, I've primarily used qualitative methods time and time again, from spending 2 years as a participant observer of VR-related activity to doing in-depth interviews. I'm also a big fan of autoethnography, which is describing my own experiences in play to supplement the other methodologies I mentioned. That being said, when I reach limits with these qualitative methods, I have used others, content analysis. I've done content analyses of everything from push notifications to articles about the recent Gamergate controversy to using survey methods. And I'm also increasingly interested in a school of thought from game studies that is interested in using game design as methodology. In other words, to use games as tools of analysis. In terms of my theoretical approach, my background is primarily coming from ludology, or the study of play and the associated theorists that come with that. That being said, I tend to be very grounded in my approach and re-theorize based on my subjects of study. However, on that note, I think it would probably be better if I described some of my projects in a bit more detail. So to begin with, I've spent the last 3-ish years studying immersive media, or VR, AR, MR, and XR headsets, along with their associated hardware. The primary way I've done this is through my dissertation research, which is now being turned into a variety of papers in a book. It looked not only at the culture and industry supporting the technology's diffusion, but how early adopters played with and experimented with it in order to understand it better. And to do this, I took a multi-method approach, which involved 90 in-depth interviews with enthusiasts who I found through a 2-year-long participant observation of VR and AR meetups in New York City. And I counterbalanced the findings from my interviews and observation with an autoethnographic account of my own adoption of VR, sort of having it win me over, and also studying the prevailing media discourses surrounding the technology's diffusion. Now, related to this, and I will put David slightly on the spot on this, is research I'm conducting with 2 other UO professors, Donna Davis and Dave Markowitz, on the discrepancies between understanding VR and empathy in popular and academic presses. Particularly when I was doing my study, VR's empathetic capabilities were being particularly touted by enthusiasts, that you could walk in the shoes of another, without acknowledging the years of scholarship and nuance surrounding the subject. And we're taking a very multi-method approach, as you might imagine, and David and I could probably talk more about that later if you like. And then the next project involving VR that I'm really excited about is looking at VR arcades as sites of technological adoption. These are often places where non-enthusiasts encounter the technology, And every single one I've encountered is almost completely different in its design, what they have, what they showcase, etc. And particularly because I want to ground this research in the work of Henri Lefebvre and the social production of public space, I think that once again, being a participant observer will be most valuable. So an arcade in New York City, for instance, has tentatively given me permission to observe and actually participate in the daily operations of it for a number of weeks, and I'd like to replicate that across the country. But one thing that's important when thinking about VR is that it has a close connection to and uses game production software, which really brings me to my second prong of research. And when I talk about game production, what I mean is that I increasingly see both the software design and labor practices of games being normalized. And this is actually something that started my academic career. I've been studying this primarily through the lens of gamification. And I've looked at the use of games in play in everything from journalism to social media to politicking, and I've published several articles and book chapters on that subject. And methodologically and theoretically, I've come at the phenomenon from theories of general economy and expenditure. I've tried to understand how these strategies, gamification strategies, fit into the excess time of workers and users. And I've relied on interviews along with the autoethnography to bolster this. For instance, when I was studying the use of games in play in newsrooms, I interviewed 38 different journalists from news outlets ranging from the Washington Post to NPR to BuzzFeed. And my most recent work sort of builds on this. It looks at how the software Unity, which is the program and engine used to make games, is coming to the forefront of many different types of 3D design, not just VR, but auto design, architecture, etc. And with it comes a lot of normative assumptions about how 3D spaces should be made. Just to sort of put it simply, the virtual worlds that you make with Unity are modeled after video games, which has both benefits and problems. And this fits into a growing body of theoretical and empirical work on the platformization of cultural production, or how the logic, economics, and technical restrictions of digital platforms are affecting labor and business practices alike. To test this, I've once again relied on the semi-structured interviews with VR enthusiasts and developers. But one place where you actually see a lot of these arguments being meted out is in journalism. It's being both covered by mainstream journalists, and they're making use of these tools. And that sort of leads me to my third area of study, which is looking both at how journalists are using games in play in their work and practices, but also how they cover games. A second book project I'm working on with David Nieborg at the University of Toronto is about the mainstreaming of games journalism, and we're in the process of doing long-form semi-structured interviews with both mainstream journalists at places like the Los Angeles Times, but also large enthusiast game journalist outlets such as Vox-owned Polygon, about how they cover the medium and the associated culture. And then looking to the future of this, I'm interested in studying the use of immersive and computer-generated content by journalists. First, with a little help from some other colleagues here at UO, I've collected all of VR films and experiences that have been made by major journalistic outlets. This is some 900 items. And I'm going to do a content analysis of these. I've already started doing some of this, and the preliminary data suggests that VR content is being used almost exclusively for soft news, tourism, travel, the things you might not associate with sort of the tenets of journalism. Next, I'd like to do ethnographic work with studios that work with journalists, such as Giant Astronaut in Portland, to understand how they deal with journalistic ethics when they are not journalists themselves. And last but not least, I want to extend work on journalist best practices to all forms of computer-generated storytelling. This ranges from everything from infographics to games to VR. And you could probably tell that these projects require a variety of methods and approaches that I'm happy to talk more about later. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much. Yay, there it is.
Our first speaker is Dr. Amanda Cote.
Right, so, it's just the PDF that's open. So we're switching up the order on you for logical reasons, because in terms of conversations that we're a part of, I should be sitting directly between these two. So you'll see those connections between our work as we go through. First, I had no idea what one puts on the cover slide of a presentation about yourself. So shout out to our communications team for this lovely headshot. I appreciate it. It looks great. I'm planning to put it on everything as soon as I get a chance. So I'm going to be talking about my research. Let's see if this clicker works.
I think it might have to be full screen first.
Green button. At the very top.
Top left.
And make sure that the clicker's on. I tend to instinctively turn
is
it off.
on.
Okay.
All right, let's see.
There we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, like I said, my work falls squarely in the middle of Max's work and Dayna's work because I also study video games, but from the perspective of gender, identity, and audience studies. So right in the middle of the kind of work that they do. And this puts me in a number of different conversations. Cultural studies, some days I think I'm a cultural studies scholar who happens to study media. Other days I'm pretty sure I'm a media studies scholar who sometimes draws on cultural studies. It's an identity crisis. But cultural studies, feminist media studies, and of course game studies are the three conversations that inform most of my work. So for examples of some of the people I draw on in those areas, in cultural studies we have cultural Marxists like Antonio Gramsci, whose theories about hegemony and the crisis of authority, where hegemony can be changed or overcome, are really key to some of my current studies, and the work of Stuart Hall, who focuses on representation in media and what being represented or not being represented can do. In the area of feminist media studies, it includes both audience studies, like Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, which studied how women approached romance novels, why they opted to engage with a medium that from an outside perspective seemed very sexist. So I'm applying some of those questions to the study of video games. And then also studies of gender and technology, like Anne Gray's Video Playtime, which studied how different leisure technologies in the home came to be seen as masculinized or feminized. And so she codes everything as a blue technology or a pink technology, and then finds some to be weird combinations of indigo or lavender based on how they're used. And then finally, in the area of game studies, I focus both on industry and on culture. So the top book illustrated here is Africa's Global Games, which is probably the only comprehensive overview of how the video game industry is structured. And then the bottom one is Gaming at the Edge, which focuses on video game culture through the lens of marginalized gamers. So those are some of the many theorists that I draw on to inform the type of work I do. I also have an array of methods depending on what question I'm answering at the time. Primarily, I draw on in-depth interviews for audience studies, so spending an hour or two or however long my participant feels like talking for, really getting into their lived experiences, seeing what their day-to-day life is like as a gamer. And right now I'm focusing specifically on female gamers. And in the past, I've also used inductive thematic analysis, which is taking a media text and drawing out its key patterns around whatever your research question is. So I've applied that to things like the video game-oriented web series The Guild, to try and see what kinds of patterns about race, gender, and gamer identity play out in that. In other times, I've used the more specific form of inductive thematic analysis known as discourse analysis, which is an inductive thematic analysis focusing specifically on language and language patterns. And I've used that to analyze video game-oriented press, to see how it talks about things like gender, how video game-oriented press talks about things like casual games and mobile games, and what kind of environment that makes within video game spaces. So right now, all of these are informing my first book project, which is tentatively titled Gaming, Sexism, Gender, Identity, and Video Games in the Early 21st Century. And it was inspired when I noticed a very interesting divergence in media narratives. So the two pictures on the top left came out in 2009, 2013, and they were part of this overall trend arguing that video games had opened up, that video games were inclusive, that anyone could be a gamer now. Women can be gamers, old people can be gamers, we should put Wiis in every nursing home to help old people be more mobile. But at the same time, absolutely simultaneously with these narratives about gaming being more welcoming, gaming being more accessible, we see a lot of incidents that show that gaming is not open and is not accessible. And so you see those illustrated in the pictures on the bottom right, which are stories about times when female gamers, developers, and cultural critics faced really virulent harassment for daring to talk about games, daring to critique tropes in games, and pointing out times when games were sexist. So I was really curious as to how these two narratives that say totally different things, one says games are welcoming, games are inclusive, the other says games are not welcoming, games are not inclusive. I was curious as to how these existed at the same time and what that meant. And so what I end up arguing in the book is that the video game industry faced some fundamental changes in the early 21st century, that the rise of casual games, mobile games, and social games like Farmville on Facebook had fundamentally changed the conditions of production. But that traditional gaming elements were resisting these. Traditional gamers were really concerned about a loss of power and control in this space. And so that's why we see this negative pushback against changes in video games, against new types of gamers. But I wasn't content just leaving it there, because a moment where things are changing is a moment where hegemony can either be re-entrenched or it can be overcome. And so I decided to speak to female gamers about how they were navigating this environment of welcome and exclusion at the same time, and what we could learn from them. So I asked them what kinds of barriers they faced to entering fully into video game culture, how they navigated these, whether they thought they could overcome them. And then the goal, of course, is to draw this out into a broader case study of how their experiences in this heavily masculinized area can teach us things about gender inequalities more inclusively. So that's the goal of the book, is to present a games-based approach to how we can overcome structural inequalities and gender discrimination. So how are these inequalities propagated, but what are strategies we can use to stop that? So that's where I am right now. I'm deep in the weeds of that book. Shout out to Brandon, who's reading every word of it and providing me feedback on how to make it more clear. He's an excellent research assistant. And in the future, these are things that I will be working on as well once this book is out of the way. So I recently became involved in a project with some of my colleagues back at the University of Michigan, where I got my PhD, where we're studying children's health and interactive digital entertainment. I came up with our acronym of CHIDE. I'm very proud of it. So this is studying how interactive technologies like video games, virtual reality, and augmented reality games like Pokemon Go can be used in a hospital context, and what the effects of that might be. So we're interested in questions about children's morale when they're in the hospital, their pain. One of the questions we're really interested in is, does playing VR or a video game decrease your perceived pain? Can it distract you from suffering in the hospital? One of my colleagues is really interested in sleep research. And so in the normal world, playing video games usually messes up your sleep because you tend to stay up too late and keep playing. But in a hospital where you don't have anything to do all day, is it possible that playing a game actually lets you sleep better at night because it gave you something to do during the day? So we've got a lot of questions about health outcomes. We've got a lot of questions about culture. How do people see the use of games in hospitals? Who are they using this technology with? And we're just getting started on that. So there are going to be a lot of possible research opportunities in the future once we start getting our feet wet. For my next book, I'm really interested in questions about gaming and how marginalized gamers seek out allies, how they band together with other gamers like them, but also if or under what circumstances they try to ally with so-called more majority or traditional gamers, straight, white, young men, things like that. And I think that that has some really interesting potential for studying identity politics more broadly. That's the key question there, is under what circumstances are identity politics useful in our current media environment? And then we're also continuing to be interested in questions of games and representation. Who gets represented as gamers? How are games themselves represented in a variety of media? So that's where I am, and I look forward to talking to all of you about it more.
Our final speaker today is fellow USC Annenberg First School for Communication alum, Dr. Dayna Chatman.
Hello. So I am going to do a little bit less formal presentation and just talk a little bit about the kind of trajectory of my work, the projects that I'm working on, the foreseeable projects that I'll be working on. So while I was doing my doctoral degree, my emphasis was focused on discourses of post-feminism within media representations, and really kind of utilize textual analysis to think about ways in which themes of post-feminism, which primarily up until that point were kind of looked at from the lens of white women, also appeared within films and television and music representations of Black women. And so one of my first publications was particularly looking at Beyonce and her kind of struggle with, was she a feminist, is she a feminist, and then come and identify as a feminist and what that meant in terms of the types of, her type of feminism. That research evolved for my dissertation to really kind of focus on representation of Black women in Black women-led shows, so shows produced by Black women such as Shonda Rhimes, Mara Keel, Issa Rae, etc. But I wanted to move beyond representation because one of the key oversights I see specifically within television audience research is a lack of conversation about Black viewers and Black fans. And so the book that I'm working on now is a kind of evolution of my dissertation. And so I'm not really good with titles, but I currently have a kind of title for it. So Black American television viewership in the age of network co-viewing. So look at the interconnection of television and new media, particularly social media, and the ways in which Black viewing audiences engage in participatory engagement online around these shows. So thinking of Insecure, Scandal, Being Mary Jane, etc. So one of the avenues that I look at as I look at the industry side in terms of strategies and promotion, so the emergence of social media teams within various networks, kind of building those social media campaigns as a project of soliciting engagement online. And I see this as particularly a phenomenon starting in, after 2012, which is when Scandal really emerged as a show that grew because of grassroots fan activity, and how the network then made use of that effective labor of fans in order to kind of strategize about how to grow the audience. And it was pretty effective, and other networks then began to take part. So that we see now is a kind of standard of how you promote your shows online, and how producers and writers and actors around the show engage with viewers online. So I mentioned the effective labor of Black viewers, Black fans, politics of viewing, which is a theoretical contribution that I aim to make, is kind of thinking about the ways in which the conversations around representations of Black women on these shows is decentering this positive and negative dynamic, and thinking about the complexities of representation, what it means politically to be represented on television, etc. So the methods that I'm kind of utilizing, particularly as it relates to analysis of, I focus most of my work on Twitter, so analysis of tweets and textual and discourse analysis, thematic analysis, with respect to social media teams, interviews, in-depth interviews, also a bit of archival research, and participate in observation, because one of the reasons how I ended up doing this work is because I myself was one of those Scandal viewers who was engaged from the early times, and saw the kind of level of the use of the media, the medium in a new way during that time. So my work in that sense is centered around television industry studies as it relates to production and promotion, because I also have done some work on thinking about the experiences of Black women showrunners and producers and writers, and how they navigate the industry, and specifically as it's kind of like continued struggle for diversity, but how it defines diversity, and what ways in which discourses about diversity emerge in the texts that are produced. And then also around promotion, as I mentioned before, around social media campaigns, representation, but also fandom and audience studies. I approach my work from a critical and cultural studies lens, but also through Black feminist thought, which is kind of centering the experiences and of Black women and thinking about knowledge production and thinking about creative production as well. Intersectionality as it relates to representational intersectionality, so thinking about the ways in which discourses about gender, race, and sexuality are integrated into certain type of themes and tropes within media representation, but also how those intersecting identities are also part of the viewing experiences or have a kind of social impact on the viewing experiences. For that, I think about David Morley's work on the social backgrounds of viewers. And then also participatory culture, so looking at ways in which kind of look at creative making, right, and engagement around these shows. After this first book, some of the work that I'm also working on now or will be working on in the future, what I envision will be my second book, is connected to fandom studies as it relates to Black women fans around K-pop, Korean pop music. And this again grew out of my own experience of being a K-pop fan and looking at the ways in which K-pop, Black women in K-pop fandom produce content, fan-related content on YouTube and other spaces, and the ways in which they experience a number of instances of anti-Blackness within fandom, but also in relation to consuming K-pop music, the kind of ways in which there's cultural appropriation and a number of anti-Black sentiments that are, often inadvertently part of the genre. So I see this as an extension of my work in terms of, again, centering Black viewers, Black fandoms, Black fans. And I'm particularly excited about the ways in which I can do a kind of cross-cultural global kind of analysis and thinking about the differences in, reception of the genre in the U.S. So with that,
thank you. So I want to open it up for questions, but before that, I wanted to give a quick plug that we can always extend this conversation at Rennie's at 4 o'clock today over beer. So, so if you're so inclined. But with that, I'll open it up to questions from the audience to any of our panelists. Ashley.
Dr. Foxman, I was wondering if you could break down what you mean by games journalism and where you think that does in the intervention of journalism more largely.
Sure. So I really it's two moderately but not quite related prongs that I'm interested in there. When I talk about games journalism, capital G, capital J, I'm talking about coverage of games. So specifically what I'm talking about in that context is critics and others that are talking about games. So primarily tech reporters, business reporters, entrepreneurial journalists, and I could lay this out in more detail later, but people interested in games. That's different than other work that I've done on journalists and games, or journalists and play, which is a much, I've produced a report and a couple of papers on this subject, but essentially I have seen the increasing use of play and game elements in journalistic content. You can think about BuzzFeed news quizzes, you can think about playful infographics, you can think about the use of VR in and of itself, building off of a tradition of news games in the early to mid 2000s as examples of journalists using games. And I think that honestly there's it's so many of the sort of basic tenets of interactivity that we think of in terms of journalistic work with infographics and interactivity fits into a lot of game logics and game design principles. So that would be the longish version.
Other questions? Eric?
Yeah, I think I have two questions. The first one to Dr. Markowitz and the second one to Smith. For Markowitz, I'd like to know, based on your understanding of your compare system, institutability regarding the analysis of corporate statements and the mindset of organizations, organizational psychology. So, for example, do you think that the system as it is now will be reliable in analyzing the mission statements, vision statements, and other statements like chairman statements and CEO statements? For example, if you want to use that as a predictor regarding the sustainability mindset of organizations.
And if
So
I could
I'd like to know that.
If I could repeat the question for the purposes of recording, it sounds like the question is about organizational discourses, and then can you get an insight into organizational psychology based on those discourses?
Yes, please. Yes. And then secondly, for Smith, you use more triangulation, and some of us are trying to adopt that approach of mixing methods. So from your experience, what do you think are some of the typical pitfalls that you've experienced in adopting that approach and how you dealt with them?
And so the question would be for Dr. Smith, how you use triangulation and the pitfalls of using triangulation that you might want to avoid. So we'll start with Dr. Markowitz.
Yeah. So the tool you mentioned is a public way of representing who I am. It's based on approaches that are even more reliable than the one that the tool that's up there is a lightweight way of explaining who I am. It's supposed to be a fun way of analyzing Twitter. You wouldn't use that for a really rigorous way of doing automated text analysis. It's just a fun tool. But other approaches, such as ones that I've used in my academic papers, would be used for if you want to understand the psychology of an organization. So, for example, you can identify corporate unethicality just from value statements of a corporation. So you evaluate ones who have ethics infractions, how they write their end-of-year statements, versus ones that don't have ethics infractions, that understand the way that they represent themselves, their interstates. I've done that in a few different ways. You can understand organizations just from their language patterns. So yeah, it's certainly possible, reliable, but I would not use that tool for the sake of it's just a fun way to represent text analysis.
Great. So in terms of triangulation, I would say it's really important for the kind of work that I do, that's working a lot with stakeholders. And the biggest pitfall, recognizing where we are, is to actually not ever leave the academy and just work with other people who are actually in the field doing the work. So many of the times for our research, we'll collect data, we'll find like initial themes, and then we take it out to people who are doing this work and say, does this make sense to you? How would you interpret this data? And you learn so much from that experience, and in terms of things that we would never know because we aren't living the experience on a daily basis. And so it really helps us have a more accurate lens, I would say, in terms of interpreting the data correctly. And really reframes how we think about the research questions that we ask next time.
If I could slip in a question for the group, and this is particularly for Drs. Foxman, Chatman, and Cote. You're studying industries that are changing rapidly almost on a daily basis. So thinking about, Dayna, your work on television now is so amorphous, and that's true of all of these. And so how do you write a book knowing that the technology is changing tomorrow or now, right?
As quickly as possible. No, actually, I got really good advice on this. One of my dissertation committee members studies historical technology, the history of technology. And so she was always pushing me to provide my work with context and say, what about this moment is particularly interesting? How are you defining it? Because then 20 years from now, my work will still be relevant to that moment, even when that moment stops being now. And so this is one of the things that I got in a bit of an argument with my book proposal reviewers about, because they really wanted me to write about Gamergate, which was a particular incidence of virulent sexism in video gaming that occurred in 2014. And I did not want to write a book about Gamergate because I thought, first, that Gamergate was a symptom of a broader problem rather than the problem. And second, because every day Gamergate gets less and less relevant. It gets older and older. So instead, I pushed back and said, I don't want to write about it this way. Here's why. I'm going to write about it this way instead. And thankfully, they understood that. So picking out what my context was, and mine's really starting with the rise of casual games and going through their first decade or so, that makes my book stay relevant even when that's not our current environment anymore. Or at least I hope it will make my book stay relevant. We will find out in 10 years.
I think mine is similarly, about context, and I kind of connect the kind of current moment or the moment that was kind of introduced by, the 2012 Shonda Rhimes moment as a kind of contextualized within the kind of 1980s, 1990s, 2000 moment in which Black producers and writers and were in the industry producing content, and you saw a wave of television and visibility of Black actors and actresses and characters on television, and thinking about one of the things that my dissertation looked at was like, is this a moment, right? A moment that's that harkens back to a previous moment, or is this going to be a sustainable, this is what the industry now looks like. I think that in contextualizing it and really raising that question, but also recognizing that this is a particular moment in which the viewing experiences have changed, or they somehow harken back to an older kind of way of viewing that's a communal viewership of television, but now it's kind of networked, right, with the use of social media, and how the industry is then making note of that modes of engagement and developing techniques around it. So again, contextualizing it, situating in a specific kind of context of this moment, and recognizing, and also kind of recognizing the absence of particular voices in audience research and fandom research as something that contributes to our broader understanding of those fields of study.
I mean, I completely agree with Amanda and Dayna. I think the only things that I could add to that are first that I think there is a certain value in the snapshot. Some of my favorite work is sort of a snapshot of a particular place in time, and I've also done, for instance, research on the late 80s, early 90s rise of the commercial internet, and there's oddly little that's saved about it. So from a curatorial aspect, there is some sort of value in saying, like, this was a moment in time, and this has value in and of itself for the sake of preservation. I think the only other thing that I would add aside from that is a lot of my theoretical and sort of background I've always been very interested in theorists that go back hundreds of years, that are talking about sort of much more, especially from an experiential point of view, that are drawing from very traditional ways of looking at the world. So I'm a big fan of Georges Bataille, who's the founder of the theory of general economy, and was writing in the 1940s. And I've always tried to find ways to take these theories and give them a little bit of that have really meant something to me, and give them traction through these modern examples. So I don't see my work as just being, let's say, about immersive media, but sitting along a continuum about the relationship of play, culture, and society. And so industry changes obviously affect that, but it's not the only way that I sort of situate my work.
Other questions from the audience? Charlie?
Amanda, I have a 12-year-old son who we don't let him play Fortnite, but he goes to his friends and they play all night. And I have a 14-year-old daughter who's not interested at all. So I'm just wondering, what is my daughter unusual, or are girls getting into it? Or just kind of curious about, especially Fortnite. You talk about a moment. Is that a moment that's going to pass?
Yes.
But where does she stand in the spectrum?
And just to restate Charlie's question, are there any gender dynamics related to Fortnite specifically?
The answer to that is yes.
Yes, there are. Fortnite. I've determined that Fortnite can't possibly be cool anymore because Fortnite dances have seeped their way into Sports Center advertising, and therefore I think we might be over the Fortnite moment. But to answer your question about gender, it is not unusual that your daughter would not be interested in video games, but your son would be so interested in them that he would circumvent your rules about them. There's a lot of research that shows that from a very early age, we gender technology towards boys and away from girls without even realizing it. There's a really interesting study from the 1980s, the early computing years, that showed that parents thought they were letting their sons and daughters use technology equally, but when their son had a problem, they told him, just keep trying, you'll figure it out. And when their daughter had a problem, they would actually step in and fix the problem for her. And so that, of course, resulted in higher technical knowledge for boys and lower technological knowledge for girls, because they didn't figure out how to problem solve. But parents thought that they were treating them evenly. So we have a lot of gendered behaviors around technology, even from a very early age, and those still matter. One of the things I push back against in my book is that headline that I had up that said 50% of video gamers are women now. it's actually 80% for some games and 5% for others. So this, how do we still navigate gendered barriers, is still a question. Like, we haven't made all games completely gender equitable. So there's still a lot going on there. And games like Fortnite, which are competitive, which are shooting games, do tend to have more of a male audience, because those are game types and game structures that are still heavily gendered as masculine. So the women I speak to in my book are actually women who play more traditionally masculine genres, to try and see, how do you get into the most sexist and the most exclusionary part of games, and what do you have to do once you're there? I'm not necessarily talking to women who play a ton of Candy Crush, although I love Candy Crush. I'm at like level 1700 or something ridiculous like that, because women don't need help getting into Candy Crush. There aren't, well, the overall milieu of Candy Crush dismisses it as feminized and casual and stupid, but women don't need help playing Candy Crush. They need help treating Candy Crush as serious. I'm interested in, how do we get more gender equity in places like Fortnite, especially because a lot of more masculine games are still connected with higher levels of knowledge of a computing system and things like that. So there's still a lot of a gender divide, and those are some of the threads I'm yanking on quite hard in my book.
As a side note, New Yorker ran an article on that very topic. They were talking about Fortnite and the gendered issues around it. I think we have time for one more question. Juan Carlos?
Yeah, David, concerning your piece in the conversation and the success of this piece all over the world, how becoming a public scholar will shape or influence your scholarship? For Hollie, you are part of the Media Center for Science and Technology. You came here in June and you have been here for a couple of months. How your participation in the Media Center for Science and Technology and helping shaping and developing the center will interact with your own scholarship and moving forward. So both of you is mainly those experiences moving forward, how this is going to influence.
The press around that piece has pushed me to ask questions that could be more public-facing in terms of their output. I was having a conversation with Ed yesterday about, like, one of the things I'm working on right now is working with the Innocence Project to detect if those who've been wrongfully convicted of a crime versus those who've been correctly convicted of a crime. So they did something or someone didn't do something, but they testified in court. How you can detect prospectively that they didn't do something wrong just from their in-court testimony. So using my language approaches to evaluate more problems that are social in nature, that are problems for social good. So it's been more about still doing the rigorous work that I think I do, but asking questions that matter for social good rather than just for the publication. And I think also a job as empiricists or academics don't stop at the publication either. So how do you communicate the science to those who need it the most? I think that's something that I'll work on, and I think it's been a motivation for every single person that I've been having conversation with here is, how do you get the findings into the hands of those who it can affect? So that's the way it's changing my work.
In terms of the Media Center for Science and Technology, I mean, really in the past few months, just thinking about the partnerships that we've been building across campus, the kind of grant applications that we're going after, it's all based on who do we partner with here at the university, other universities, and really what kind of funding we get through that will shape my scholarship in terms of what we're exactly studying. But the other big thing I think that's happening is, as we go through and are seeking out a lot of this funding, it's going to be changing what kind of curriculum we're teaching through the MCST. So, for example, one of the grants that we're putting in for right now is an undergraduate science education grant, but the science communication courses we're proposing would be run through the J School. And so it would be large-scale science communication courses for students both in the J School and outside of the J School, but it would all be based on research. And then we would track the outcomes of those kind of students who enroll in those classes, you know, and then they would have to go do internships over the summer where they work, you know, at places like science centers, museums, these science communication experiences. And then we would look at, you know, what are the effects that those kind of trainings have. So really thinking about partnerships and then how we think about science communication education, both at the undergrad and the graduate level here at the University of Oregon.
Thank you. We are right on the money, but I want to start by thanking our panelists. I know for me, I have a greater appreciation for the interdisciplinarity of our program, the diverse research that's coming out of it. Again, let's extend this conversation at 4 o'clock at Rennie's over a beer. So thank you all for